really stayed a social worker throughout all of my career. I've just changed my caseload from local communities to state child welfare to national politics to the international arena. But the principles have stayed the same, and I must say it's a very strange time to be talking about the federal policymaking process and social work. But current events are very critical to understanding and appreciating the importance of federal policymaking and the many ways that social workers can make a difference. Change and working for change, championing change is endemic to being a social worker, and for me, simply part of my genes. But along the way, I've learned some things about change, things that are very important to remember at this point in the decisions our leaders and all of us have to make. Change for change's sake is not always good. Sometimes one can't force change. Change is inevitable. Change can be exhilarating and change can be exhausting. There are limits to controlling change, and ultimately, life happens. Change and all. And we, as social workers, must champion the best and fight against the worst. I want to spend a few minutes talking about the changes broadly in the world, and then return to the recent tragic events and the few positive things that may come out of this horror and the public policy problems we all must confront. We are now living in an era of exceedingly rapid change. We have all heard the predictions and realities of wireless internet on Palm Pilots or watches communicating also as global cell phones. Email has already ended the agony of 3 a.m. phone calls to the other side of the world, and even when I was working with North Korea, one of life's most extraordinary experiences, I could send a letter instantaneously by fax. Stock markets and media cycles are global. A seamless main street of trade and pictures coming so fast that we could rarely call members of Congress about events before they were already on CNN. The human genome mapping has accelerated knowledge beyond measure, and treatments for disease through drugs or bioengineering food creates wonderful opportunities and staggering challenges. At the same time that we see changes that bring the world and life closer, we also see more complex and sometimes dangerous change. Only 23.5% of American households are nuclear families. Some might say this reflects tolerance for different kinds of households, and that is good. But the numbers also reflect single-parent households under even greater stress, an aging population in need of new services and new thinking, just witness AARP's new ad campaign, and many divorced households with reconstituted and conflicting family structures. Unemployment numbers, which had looked much better than the last decade, still mask the racial and gender salary and unemployment imbalances, and don't speak at all to the number of Americans in sometimes dead-end jobs in the fastest growing service sector of our economy. And in our country built by immigrants, the Hispanic population is the fastest growing, but often in communities that speak little Spanish, or demand only English. And Muslim Americans, are the fastest growing religious sector of our country, a religion few Americans understand or appreciate. When we first came in the Clinton administration, our calendars for planning only marked Christian and Jewish holidays. Before we left, Muslim holy days became part of our planning and our rhythm. Assimilation has always been a controversial social process and will be even more so in our global community. On the international front, developing countries possess weapons of mass destruction. Terrorists, at home and abroad, hold the power to undo anything that is seemingly done, and I wrote that sentence before September 11th. And humanity faces the terror of disease and environmental degradation. I don't have to tell you all that 36 million people are infected with HIV with 14,000 new cases every day. In much of southern Africa, AIDS will kill a third of today's 15-year-olds, and thousands of other children are or will become orphans. Refugees and displaced persons still cover the earth, caught in racial and ethnic conflicts that leave people without homes, wanderers for virtually an entire childhood. Likewise, in spite of a few who do not see or feel, the globe is warming, with changes to our environment that will affect life in ways we are not even yet aware. So you who are here as social workers or becoming social workers, go out to work in a world that is moving faster than any individual can. You face an enormous challenge in helping individuals, groups, organizations, and societies cope with and make opportunities out of this change. And ironically, in a world that is coming closer together through technology, we also seem to be a world longing for connection, real intimacy, and true meaning. The very rapidity of change makes us long for roots, for sameness, and at the same time preserving cultural difference, for calm, for a moment of quiet. Your mission, which you already have chosen, is to work for positive change, and the precepts of social work must be at the center of all that you do, for those are the principles that will ensure that change and public policy will be positive, humane, and progressive. Our code of ethics calls on us to enhance well-being and to meet basic human needs, to empower the people with whom we work, to ensure that we service people who are oppressed and vulnerable, to focus on individuals in the context of society, to promote social justice, and to ensure that we meet all of these challenges with a sensitivity to cultural and ethnic diversity. So how do we help people not only cope but thrive in a rapidly changing environment? For myself, whether as a social worker working in protective services and foster care, as a social worker organizing a political campaign for a fighter for change, now Senator Barbara Mikulski, or as a social worker organizing change in the world, I've always started in the same place. I've always started with social work principles. First, begin with where your client is. You cannot make them be somewhere they are not. I will never forget the battered spouse I worked with in a Georgia mental health program whose husband tried to smother her with a pillow. You must leave, I told her. How can you stay, I admonished. She knew, she said, but she never returned to see me again. She wasn't ready. I didn't begin where she was. I didn't help her to change. I insisted she get to the end of the story before she had a chance to tell it. And I learned how important it was to have a federally mandated community mental health system ready, to have the resources ready when she was ready. Second, empower your client, whether an individual or a people or a country, to leave our services behind. Give her the tools of microcredit to make a living in a village. Organize workers to form a union to fight for themselves. Provide technical assistance to ensure a fair election and be there afterwards to provide technical assistance to build an economy. Encourage the hospice movement. Fight for legislation to support it. Become part of it yourself, to empower even those who are about to leave us truly behind to do so on their own terms with grace and dignity. And empower yourselves through public policy, because you cannot help the powerless if you yourselves feel powerless. Third, work at the start for that which is small, immediate, and realizable. Change is inviting rather than overwhelming when we can succeed and make progress. Maybe all that can happen this month is to have her come secretly to the clinic in Botswana for treatment so that perhaps her child-to-be is not born with AIDS. Maybe the village women are not yet ready to give up breastfeeding if to do so means that everyone will assume those who don't have AIDS. Maybe the better strategy is to get all women to use bottles, to find support and sisterhood in the wake of tragedy, to quietly create a new public policy for these times. Nowhere is this principle more evident than the use of technology for positive change. The International Landmines Treaty, a critical public policy which the U.S. is not yet a signatory to, will begin to reduce the devastation of exploding limbs. That happened over the internet when Jody Williams began email by email organizing individuals and groups into a movement which surprised governments and made change. She began with a vision but not a certainty, and what started as immediate, making connections, became a historic change in public policy. Change takes time, and like simple things like weight loss and getting back in shape, rarely comes without pain, setbacks, and learning. Steady, persistent, incessant strategies and tactics more often meet the challenges than gimmicks or those horrible phrases we use, silver bullets or blow-ups. That doesn't mean that confrontation, mobilization, public relations, radical rules for reveille do not have a place in change. They are essential to change, but as conscious tactics towards a well-defined objective. It is critical to understand the power of organizing, of groups moving to change critical policies. Perhaps the most moving experience I ever had while in service to this country at the State Department was the opportunity to visit what now has just cascaded back into my mind, the Peshawar refugee camp on the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. Myself, Madeleine Albright, a couple of other women that were with us were allowed to go into a house privately with women who would not have these discussions in front of the men with us and talk about how they had escaped the Taliban, how sisters had died jumping out of windows, how women who had been raped had fled their country, how these women had been teachers and homemakers and even doctors once upon a time, and now had been relegated to even less than second status. But these women had extraordinary courage to continue to build a community, create schools in these camps, which were very difficult, and to try to create a life somewhere else, and to continue in quiet and often secret ways to bring about change in not only the policy in their country, but the policy in the world. And God knows if they can do these things, so can we. It is hard to change alone. So build a support group for yourself wherever you are and hope those you are helping to do likewise. That's what lobbying Congress is about, building a support group for your cause. When I was director of child welfare in Maryland, I lived for Thursday evenings with other women social workers who gathered at Harbor Place to share stories and gain strength for another week's battles. When years later, as an organizer in the world, I worked to change our relation to North Korea and North Korea's relationship to the world, we organized a tight trilateral mechanism with the South Koreans and the Japanese to compare notes, plot strategies, develop a coordinated public policy, and make sure we worked toward the change we all wanted without leaving North Korea in the driver's seat, darting in and out of our relationships. Values must underlay change. Change is not in itself an inherent good except in the sense of the Zen of life. So know what you are doing and why, question your assumptions more than once, and challenge conventional wisdom. In the 1970s, we moved everyone out of state mental institutions. Policymakers thought that if there wasn't rapid and profound change, the inertia of the system would maintain a status quo that was pretty bad. You all know or have read about the results. A sharp increase in homelessness, communities unprepared, and treatment programs non-existent. Were the policymakers wrong? Not entirely. But the strategy was not thought through enough. The hard work to prepare communities and develop new models was not yet done at state and local levels, and the research had not all been done that was needed, and so we created new problems. So the pendulum swings back to smaller models of institutionalization, group homes, and residential facilities. Change was needed, inertia was powerful, but in our rush to public policy, some lives were lost in our zeal for rapid, unalterable change. Finally, most profoundly, as we have found, life happens. Change occurs you cannot control, you do not like, and you, we, I, must deal. I cannot begin to describe, for instance, the truly surreal feeling of January 20th, 2001. At 9 in the morning, Bill Clinton was president, Madeleine Albright was Secretary of State, I was counselor of the Department of State. We were on a path to resolve the Middle East crisis. We were close to negotiating an end to some of North Korea's most egregious missile proliferation. We had supported the Kyoto Protocol, even though there was much work ahead. We were a strong voice for human rights in the United Nations. We were fully committed to doing everything we could to end gun violence, halt the spread of AIDS, conserve energy, preserve our national parks, ensure our women's right to choose, and give tools to groups and individuals in our country and abroad that were still left behind. At noon, that same day, George Bush was president, Colin Powell was Secretary of State, and there was, and still isn't, a counselor. All foreign policy initiatives and many domestic changed. Tax cuts and increases for education shaped the new agenda. The public policy agenda was transformed only to be shaped again by one senator who, in a move for independence, shifted the checks and balances. And then, in ways rarely experienced in our history, September 11th changed everything. Public policy became truly public rather than partisan. Terror struck our backyard, literally, and priorities shifted dramatically. We are in a long-term struggle against terrorism, and its impact on other agendas is profound. You can help shape the future as we try to answer some of the following of the myriad of questions. What happens to domestic needs of health and welfare? Will we use money we don't even have anymore for improving our public health system in the face of a potential biological or chemical threat rather than, or on top of, addressing a patient's Bill of Rights? Will we review our immigration policy with Mexico, necessitating new services in communities in America, or will we shut our doors to people out of fear? Will we urge people to conserve energy to cushion a potential problem in the Middle East as America's new war goes forward, or will we drill in Anwar in Alaska? And abroad, will we obliterate the government of Afghanistan, as suspect as it is, and at the same time help the Afghan people who have suffered dramatically? Will HIV/AIDS ever get back on the agenda? And for that matter, aren't the anti-globalization feelings of many in the developing world part of the anger that creates an environment for terrorism? Or are these quite separate but legitimate needs? And what of the lessons learned? I was very privileged to visit the Family Center last week in New York. It is extraordinary. It is the kind of one-stop center, open, caring, embracing, that we have all worked for. Can this become a model of how services ought to be delivered all of the time? And the community outreach to help, to support, to sustain people confronting loss. How can we harness such energy, such spirit over time for other problems in our communities? So many hard questions. But we are living in a moment where there is some energy to answer some of them. Our college campuses, as I just found out personally on Parents' Weekend last weekend, are asking questions we haven't heard since my generation was in college during the Vietnam War. Our Constitution and its freedoms are being stretched in new and unknown ways. People all over the world know in excruciating ways that they do not understand each other, that religion and ethnicity, color and class are too alive and well, and the killing fields of this century too. As you spend today, and I hope many days, practicing in the realm of public policy, remember, ultimately, that is what social work is about. Creating change, empowering individuals and the world, change for those who need a hand up, change for a future of promise for those coming up, change for the seasons of life, change for peace and security and prosperity for every individual, wherever they are, in whatever circumstances they begin. It is hard, It is sometimes slow and sometimes terribly swift. But to stand aside is not an option when you are a social worker. Thank you.